They don't teach this in school, and they don't put plaques on these houses or names in textbooks. And because some American stories were never meant to survive daylight, and beneath the fields, the forests, the quiet towns you drive through without a second thought, there are family histories that didn't fade away. They were buried. Not forgotten by accident, but erased on purpose. Bloodlines that carried secrets so heavy they warped the people born into them. Names that once meant power, land, survival, and later meant shame, silence, and isolation. And this story begins where records stop making sense. Census pages with crossed-out names, birth certificates that don't match ages, graves without markers, entire families that disappear and reappear generations later, changed, broken, quiet in ways that feel unnatural. And America loves the myth of fresh starts, new land, new names, new lives. But blood doesn't reset when you cross a river or build a cabin. It remembers, it carries patterns, and in the most isolated corners of this country, those patterns turned inward. And these weren't monsters, they were families, flarberers. People who learned early that survival meant staying hidden, staying close, trusting only their own. Over time, isolation became tradition. Tradition became law, and law became blood, and doctors would later whisper about degeneration. Neighbors would avoid eye contact. Children would be kept indoors. Some couldn't speak. Some couldn't read. Some never learned what the outside world looked like. But no one intervened, because these families lived beyond attention, beyond help, beyond care. And when the outside world finally noticed, it didn't come with compassion. It came with cameras, clipboards, labels. The families were studied like curiosities, photographed like warnings, then abandoned again, this time with their dignity stripped away. And the cruelest truth, many of these bloodlines still exist. Not as legends, but as living echoes, people carrying the weight of choices made long before they were born, choices no child consented to, choices no one talks about now. And this is not a story about blame, it's a story about silence, about what happens when isolation lasts too long, when shame becomes inheritance, and when an entire nation decides it's easier not to look. And because once you see what was hidden in these bloodlines, you start to realize something far more disturbing. And some American horrors didn't come from violence, and they came from family, and the earliest records don't scream tragedy. They whisper it, and on paper, these families look ordinary. Names repeated across generations, same plots of land, same occupations, farming, trapping, logging, work that rewarded isolation, work that punished curiosity. Census takers would ride in once every 10 years, knock on the door, and accept whatever answers they were given. No one checked twice, no one stayed long, and then slowly, the patterns begin, and children listed as younger than they are. Sisters marked as daughters, women giving birth well into ages that shouldn't have been possible, unless the truth was something no one wanted to write down. In some records, the mother's name disappears entirely, replaced by a blank line, as if acknowledging her would force someone to ask the wrong question. And isolation wasn't accidental, it was enforced. Roads ended before reaching these homes. Schools were miles away and rarely attended. Churches tried to visit once or twice, then stopped coming back. Outsiders weren't welcomed, but with something colder, closed doors, long stairs, silence. And inside those homes, the rules were different. Blood was everything. Loyalty meant survival. Leaving meant betrayal. Children were raised knowing the family came before all else, because the outside world couldn't be trusted. And when your entire universe is a single household, boundaries don't just blur, they vanish. And over generations, love became obligation. Obligation became expectation, and expectation became something darker, and doctors were almost never called. When they didn't stay. They noted oddities, physical differences, delays, behaviors that didn't fit neatly into medical language at the time. The solution wasn't treatment, it was distance. These families were labeled hopeless, then quietly abandoned by the systems meant to protect them. And neighbors noticed. Of course they did. But in small towns, noticing isn't the same as acting. It's easier to look away. Easier to say that's just how they are. Easier to let discomfort rot into rumor, and then rumors spread faster than help ever could. And stories of children who never learned to speak, of adults who flinched at unfamiliar voices, of faces that looked strangely similar across generations. Same eyes, same jawlines, same expressions frozen in time. But no one connected the dots out loud. Saying it would mean responsibility, and responsibility is heavy. And by the time the outside world truly arrived, with universities, researchers, reporters, the damage was already written into the blood. Generations shaped by isolation had become exhibits, evidence, case studies, and then the families learned a final lesson, and silence was safer than truth. And when the cameras finally appeared, they didn't come to help, and they came to observe. And men in pressed coats, women with notebooks, flashbulbs cracking the darkness of rooms that had never known electricity. The families didn't understand why they were suddenly interesting. They were told to stand still, to look forward, to answer questions they didn't fully understand. Some smiled, some stared past the lens like they were already somewhere else. And those photographs would travel farther than any member of the family ever had. And universities archived them, newspapers printed them, lectures were built around them. Words like degenerate, defective, and unfit were used freely, not in whispers but in academic language that made cruelty sound official. These families became proof, warnings, convenient examples of what happens when isolation goes too far, and no one asked why isolation happened in the first place. And the children in those photos didn't know they were being turned into symbols. They didn't know their faces would be studied decades later by strangers who never learned their names. To the outside world, they weren't people. They were outcomes. And then the attention didn't last. And once the studies were complete, once the articles were published, the researchers left. Funding moved on. Interest faded. The families were returned to the same houses, the same routines, the same silence. Only now, they carried the weight of being watched. And some tried to leave after that. A few escaped into nearby towns. But the world wasn't kinder there. Employers whispered. Children were mocked. Doctors refused care or treated them like curiosities. The message was clear. You don't outrun your reputation. And so many went back, and inside the family the shame deepened. They stopped talking to outsiders altogether. Windows were covered. Names were changed or shortened. Births went unregistered. Deaths went unannounced. The bloodline learned to erase itself in pieces, hoping invisibility would feel safer than judgment, but blood doesn't forget. And as years passed, the effects compounded. Health issues worsened. Cognitive limitations became more pronounced. Trauma layered itself generation upon generation, not from a single act, but from a lifetime of being told, directly or indirectly, that you were less than human. And the cruel irony is that these families weren't doomed by biology alone, and they were abandoned by everyone who had the power to intervene and chose not to. And when modern eyes look back at these cases, it's easy to feel detached, to frame it as a relic of the past. But the echoes are closer than we like to admit. The descendants still live among us. Some don't know their own history. Others know it too well and spend their lives running from it. And because once your bloodline becomes a warning, there's no handbook for healing. And what history rarely records is what it feels like to be born into a silence you didn't choose. And imagine growing up knowing there are rooms in your family's past no one is allowed to enter. Questions that end conversations. Names that tighten faces. You learn early not to ask why your grandparents never left the property. Why no one has childhood photos outside the same few walls. Why certain relatives are never mentioned at all. And for many descendants of these bloodlines, childhood wasn't marked by violence. It was marked by absence. No doctors, no teachers, no outside voices to tell you that what you're experiencing isn't normal, or that it's not your fault. And normal is whatever you're born into. And trauma doesn't always scream. Sometimes it settles. It becomes routine. It teaches children how to lower their eyes, how to stay quiet, how to avoid attention. It teaches them that safety comes from invisibility. And when invisibility becomes survival, connection feels dangerous. And these families didn't just inherit genetic consequences. They inherited fear, fear of outsiders, fear of institutions, fear of being seen. Every knock on the door felt like a threat. Every unfamiliar face felt like exposure. And over time, the outside world became a myth, a place that judged, a place that punished difference, a place that took photos and left. So the family closed tighter, spoke less, trusted only blood, even when blood was the very thing causing harm. And some descendants later described a sense of being watched even when no one was there, as if history itself had eyes. As if the past was waiting for them to step out of line. And then when a few finally did, when they tried to integrate, to work, to love, to build something separate, they carried invisible weight. Social cues felt foreign, authority felt threatening, medical environments felt humiliating. Many self-isolated again, not because they wanted to, but because it felt familiar. And this is how cycles survive, and not through cruelty alone, but through neglect, through systems that label and abandon, through communities that whisper instead of help, through a nation that documented suffering without taking responsibility for it. And the most unsettling part is this: if you met some of these descendants today, you wouldn't recognize the story. They look ordinary, sound ordinary, live quiet lives. The horror isn't visible anymore, and it's internal, and it lives in anxiety with no clear origin, in shame without a memory, in families that don't talk about why certain traditions exist, only that they must. And that's how a bloodline becomes a ghost, and still present, still influencing, but never acknowledged. And by the time the country modernized, these bloodlines were already invisible, and highways were built around them. Towns expanded in other directions. What had once been remote became deliberately overlooked. The families weren't isolated anymore, they were bypassed. And in that quiet neglect, the damage deepened in ways that never made headlines. And social workers came and went. Reports were filed. Recommendations were made. But nothing stuck. Helping required patience, funding, and empathy. Three things rarely extended to people already labeled as lost causes. It was easier to treat the problem as historical, even while it was still breathing. And inside these families, something fragile began to crack, and younger generations felt the weight without fully understanding its source. They sensed they were different before anyone told them they were. They watched how strangers reacted, how conversations changed once last names were mentioned, how curiosity turned into discomfort, and some tried to reinvent themselves. New names, new cities, new lives built on the hope that distance could dilute blood, and for a while it worked. Until anxiety surfaced, until relationships felt unsafe, until the fear of being found out poisoned moments that should have felt normal. And because shame doesn't disappear when you escape geography, it travels internally, and others stayed. Not because they believed in the old ways, but because leaving felt like betrayal. When your family has survived by closing ranks for generations, independence feels like abandonment. Love and captivity become hard to separate, and so the bloodline continues, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, painfully, through people trying to be normal while carrying something they never asked for. And this is the part of the story that never makes documentaries, and the aftermath, and the therapy sessions that don't have names for inherited silence. The children raised by parents who don't know how to trust systems. The adults who feel watched by a past they didn't live, yet can't escape. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? And because confronting this truth forces an uncomfortable realization. And these families weren't ruined by one decision, and they were shaped by generations of looking away, and there's a temptation to believe this kind of history is over. And that modern laws, modern medicine, and modern awareness closed the door on bloodlines like these. That whatever damage was done belongs to another century, another America, a darker version we've outgrown. But history doesn't end when attention moves on, and in interviews conducted decades later, some descendants struggle to describe what they inherited. Not illness, not stories, but a feeling, a constant readiness for something to go wrong, a belief that safety is temporary, that closeness leads to consequences. And these are not genetic traits you can test for, and they are learned responses passed down like heirlooms. A mother who never trusts authorities raises a child who flinches at forms and offices. A father who learned silence as survival teaches his children that speaking up invites danger. The past trains the present without ever introducing itself. And what makes this legacy especially cruel is how easily it hides. And trauma doesn't announce its origin. It disguises itself as personality, as anxiety, as withdrawal, as anger that doesn't seem to match the moment. People are told to move on from things they never personally experienced, because no one sees the invisible chain pulling them backward. And when descendants try to explain, they're often met with disbelief, or worse, fascination, as if inherited suffering is only valid when it's dramatic enough to entertain, as if quiet damage doesn't count. And some families attempted to document their own history later, to reclaim names, to humanize ancestors who were reduced to case studies, but records were incomplete, files sealed or lost, photographs mislabeled, the truth fragmented beyond repair, and so the story survives in pieces, and in behaviors that don't make sense on paper. In families that don't ask questions because they're afraid of the answers. In a deep, unspoken understanding that something went wrong, and that no one is coming to fix it. And this is where the horror truly lives, and not in deformity, not in scandal, but in the realization that a nation can observe suffering, categorize it, and then walk away, leaving the consequences to echo quietly through generations. And the forgotten bloodlines weren't erased, and they were absorbed, and their legacy didn't end. It learned how to hide in plain sight. And if you dig long enough into American soil, you stop finding answers, and you find silence. And the forgotten bloodlines don't leave behind neat conclusions or moral resolutions. There's no single moment where everything went wrong, no villain you can point to and feel relieved that the story has an ending. What remains is heavier than that. The understanding that suffering can be ordinary, systemic, and quietly inherited. And these families weren't legends. They weren't curses. They were people shaped by geography, neglect, and fear, caught in a loop no one interrupted soon enough. And the most unsettling truth is that the conditions that created them were never unique. Isolation still exists. Poverty still isolates, shame still silences, and institutions still choose efficiency over empathy. And the reason these stories disturb us isn't because they're foreign, and it's because they're familiar, and every generation likes to believe it would have acted differently, that it would have intervened, that it would have helped. But history suggests otherwise. We are very good at noticing suffering, and very bad at staying once it becomes uncomfortable. And the bloodlines faded from headlines, but their lesson didn't fade with them. It lingers in how easily we label people as beyond help, in how quickly we turn trauma into spectacle, in how often we confuse documentation with responsibility. And this story was never meant to make you feel superior to the past, and it was meant to make you question the present. And because somewhere, right now, there are families being quietly ignored, children growing up without voices, patterns forming that won't be recognized until it's too late, and then studied instead of stopped. And the archive is still open. And then once you've seen what was hidden in these bloodlines, you can't unsee it. You carry it forward, whether you want to or not. The knowledge that history isn't buried because it's resolved, it's buried because it's inconvenient. And some truths don't stay underground forever, and they wait. And then when they surface, they ask a simple, unsettling